The grand arena of the Zarelian Empire was packed with spectators. Thousands of alien nobles, warriors, and citizens filled the towering stone stands, eager to witness the long-awaited duel. The air hummed with excitement and tension, a low vibration running through the stadium as drums echoed in rhythmic beats. In the center of the vast arena stood Princess Valithra, her body clad in the ceremonial armor of her people. The black and silver plating reflected the bright suns above, a reminder of the long history of the Zarelian warrior caste. Her deep violet eyes scanned the crowd before settling on the tall figure standing opposite her. Her opponent, a human. Valithra clenched her jaw, her fingers tightening around the hilt of her curved blade. She had fought countless warriors, some of the strongest in the Empire. But this was different. Never before had a human been invited to an Imperial combat trial. And yet, Captain Dorian Kane stood before her, calm and focused. The man was taller than she expected, his frame muscular, but not overly bulky. His dark brown hair was cut short, and his sharp green eyes studied her with quiet patience. Unlike Zarelian warriors, who adorned themselves with ceremonial markings and armor, the human wore a simple black combat uniform with armored plates over his chest, arms, and legs. A single vibroblade rested in his hand. A human weapon, simple yet deadly. Valithra did not like this. Her pride demanded that she prove her superiority. She was a princess of the Empire, trained since childhood in the art of war. Losing was not an option. The arena fell silent as the High Warlord, her father, stood from his throne above. His voice, deep and commanding, echoed across the stadium. Let the trial of strength begin. A gong rang through the air. The duel had begun. The first move. Valithra wasted no time. She rushed forward, her blade slicing through the air toward Dorian's side. It was a swift, precise attack, meant to end the battle quickly. But the human sidestepped effortlessly. Her strike missed by inches, hitting nothing but the empty space where he had once stood. Before she could recover, Dorian countered, bringing his sword down in a clean, controlled motion. Valithra barely had time to block, her arm trembling slightly from the impact. Her eyes widened. His strength was immense. She pushed back, forcing distance between them. The crowd murmured in surprise. This was not supposed to happen. A Zarelian princess should overwhelm a human, not struggle against one. Dorian did not gloat or smile. He simply watched her, studying her stance, her breathing, her movements. He was waiting for her next move. Valithra growled in frustration. She would not be humiliated. She charged again, this time using a feint, pretending to strike high before twisting her body to sweep low. Dorian reacted instantly, too fast. He blocked the feint and dodged the real attack, twisting his body in a way that showed he had studied her fighting style. Valithra felt a sting of frustration. This was no ordinary human, a battle of skill. She adjusted her grip, breathing deeply. This time, she changed her strategy. Instead of relying on brute strength, she focused on speed and technique. She lunged again, her blade flashing in the sunlight. This time, their swords clashed in a rapid exchange, metal ringing through the arena as they moved like shadows around each other. Dorian was fast, but Valithra was relentless. She pressed forward, attacking from different angles, forcing him to stay on the defensive. But he never faltered. Every attack she delivered, he countered with perfect timing. It was as if he could predict her next move. The longer the fight continued, the more she realized the truth. Dorian was not fighting with brute strength or instinct. He was thinking, adapting, learning. And for the first time in her life, Princess Valithra felt unsure of her victory. The watching eyes. Above them, the High Warlord watched the fight unfold with unreadable eyes. The nobles whispered among themselves. The crowd, once cheering for their princess, had fallen silent. This was no ordinary duel. This was a test unlike any other. And Valithra was realizing that humans were not to be underestimated. As the battle continued, She clenched her teeth. She would not lose. But she knew now. Defeating this human would not be easy. The sounds of clashing metal filled the grand arena. The fight between Princess Valithra and Captain Dorian Kane had lasted longer than anyone expected. The Xyrelian crowd, once loud and cheering for their princess, now watched in stunned silence. Valithra had trained her entire life to be a warrior. She had fought the strongest of her people and won. But this human, he was different. Every attack she threw at him, he blocked, dodged, or countered. And worst of all, he was calm. Dorian's green eyes never wavered. He was not frustrated, not angry, not afraid. He was studying her, adjusting his strategy, learning from her moves. Valithra gritted her teeth. She refused to be humiliated in front of her people. This was not just a battle. This was a fight for honor, the unbreakable defense. Valithra circled him, blade in hand. Her breathing was controlled, but her muscles burned from the relentless fight. She moved again, swinging fast and hard. Dorian met her strike with perfect timing, blocking just enough to deflect her attack, but not waste energy. She growled in frustration. He wasn't even using full force. She attacked again, high, low, then a spin aimed at his ribs. But Dorian was already there, stepping aside and knocking her blade away just enough to keep himself safe. Valithra stumbled slightly, feeling her heart pound in her chest. This was not a normal duel. Xyrelian warriors fought with strength and aggression. Humans, they fought with intelligence. Reading the opponent, Dorian stepped back slightly, keeping a balanced stance. "You're strong," he said at last, his voice steady, "but you're wasting energy." Valithra's eyes flashed with anger. "Silence, human," she hissed, lunging forward. Dorian barely moved, tilting his head just enough to dodge her strike. It was insulting. He was not fighting her. He was studying her. Valithra clenched her fists around her weapon, her breathing sharp. Why did it feel like she was losing when she was still standing? The warrior's struggle. She tried to change her approach. Instead of using brute force, she focused on speed and precision. Her sword became a blur, fast and deadly. Dorian, however, adjusted again. He didn't try to match her speed. He waited for her to make a mistake. And then it happened. She struck too hard, overextending for just a second. It was all he needed. Dorian caught her wrist mid-swing and twisted, using her own momentum against her. Before she could react, he had disarmed her. Her sword flew across the arena, clattering to the ground. The entire stadium gasped. Valithra, the pride of the Xyrelian Empire, the strongest of her generation, stood unarmed in front of a human warrior. She refused to accept it. Without thinking, she moved in close and threw a punch at his face. Dorian caught her wrist again. This time, he didn't let go. The human's lesson. The world felt frozen for a moment. Dorian did not attack. He did not mock her. He simply held her wrist, his grip firm, but not cruel. His voice was quiet when he spoke. Fighting isn't just about strength. Valithra's breath came fast. She wanted to pull away. She wanted to keep fighting. But she couldn't. She had been defeated. Not because she was weak. She knew that. She had lost because she had underestimated him. Humans did not fight like Xyrelians. They adapted. They learned. And above all, they never gave up. The moment of realization. Dorian finally released her wrist and took a step back. "If this were a real fight," he said, "you'd be dead." The words hit harder than any strike. Valithra's pride burned. She had thought humans were weaker than her people. But Dorian had proven otherwise. The High Warlord, her father, watched from above with an unreadable expression. The crowd, still silent, waited for her next move. Would she accept her loss? Or would she refuse to acknowledge his strength? Valithra clenched her fists. This was not over. Not yet. The Xyrelian Princess Valithra stood frozen, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths. Her sword lay several feet away on the dusty ground. She had been disarmed by a human, a warrior who had not even been raised in their traditions. The crowd of nobles, warriors, and spectators did not cheer or boo. They simply watched, waiting to see what she would do next. High above, the High Warlord, her father, observed the scene with an expression that revealed nothing. And across from her, Captain Dorian Kane, the human warrior, simply stood with his weapon lowered. His green eyes were calm, his stance steady, as if he was not celebrating a victory but waiting for something more. Valithra's hands curled into fists. She had trained her whole life to be the strongest, to carry the honor of her people, to never lose. And yet, she had lost. The weight of defeat. Valithra took a slow breath, trying to calm the storm inside her. Everything inside her demanded she keep fighting, that she prove she was superior. But deep down, something else stirred, a doubt she had never felt before. Why had this battle been different? Why had she struggled against a human? She clenched her jaw. She had underestimated him. She had fought like she always did, using power, speed, and brute force. But Dorian had fought with something else. Tactics, adaptability, experience. He had read her movements, seen her weaknesses, and used them against her. And now, as she stood in front of him, unarmed and breathing heavily, she had to face the truth. Strength alone was not enough to win. Dorian's perspective. Dorian studied Valithra carefully. He had seen this look before, the look of a warrior who had never tasted defeat. It was a dangerous moment. Some warriors accepted their loss and learned from it. Others let their pride destroy them. He tightened his grip on his sword, just in case. But then, to his surprise, Valithra took a step back, away from him. She was struggling, not physically, but internally. Dorian could see it in her eyes. This fight had not been about proving she was strong. It had been about proving she was stronger than him. And now that belief had been shaken. A warrior's decision. Valithra's heart pounded as she turned her gaze to the High Warlord's throne. Her father sat there, unmoving, waiting, judging. He would not tell her what to do. The decision was hers. Would she accept her loss and walk away with dignity? Or would she ignore the truth and fight until she had nothing left? She inhaled sharply, then walked forward. Not toward Dorian, but toward her fallen sword. The crowd tensed, unsure of what she would do next. Even Dorian's stance shifted slightly, preparing for another attack. But Valithra did not lunge at him. She bent down, picked up her weapon, and held it at her side. Then she turned to face Dorian once more. Her voice was steady, but something had changed in it. "You are not like the warriors I have faced before," she admitted. Dorian raised an eyebrow. "No." She shook her head. "You don't fight with pride or tradition. You fight with your mind." Dorian smirked slightly. That's how humans survive. She studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "If we had met in war, I would have thought you weak," she said quietly, "and I would have been wrong." Dorian tilted his head. "And what do you think now?" Valithra exhaled slowly. "I think I have more to learn." Respect earned. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. The proud Xyrelian princess, admitting she still had something to learn. This had never happened before. Dorian studied her for a moment before giving a small nod. "Then you're already stronger than you were before this fight," he said. Valithra blinked, slightly caught off guard. Strength had always meant winning, but now she wasn't so sure. Maybe strength was also about learning, adapting, growing. For the first time in her life, she saw a human not as an enemy, but as something else. An equal, a warrior, a challenge. She tightened her grip on her sword and smiled slightly. "This is not over, human," she warned. "One day, I will defeat you." Dorian chuckled. "I'll be waiting, princess." And with that, the duel was officially over. But their story had only just begun. The tension in the Zorelian Grand Arena had not faded, even after the duel had ended. Princess Valithra stood tall, her sword resting at her side, but her mind was still reeling from what had just happened. She had never expected a human, a species known for their fragile bodies, to match her in battle. But Captain Dorian Kane had not only fought her evenly, he had forced her to think differently about strength itself. The crowd remained silent, waiting for what would happen next. Above them, the High Warlord, her father, sat on his throne, his expression unreadable. Would he call this duel an honorable fight, or would he see her struggle as a weakness? The aftermath of battle. Dorian adjusted the grip on his sword, watching Valithra carefully. She had accepted her loss, but she was far from defeated. There was still fire in her eyes, and for the first time since stepping into the arena, he realized something. This wasn't the end of their fight. It was just the beginning. Valithra exhaled sharply, pushing aside her frustration. She knew she had to face the consequences of this duel. Turning toward the throne, she knelt on one knee and bowed her head. "I have fought with honor," she said, her voice steady, "but I was not victorious." The arena was so quiet that even the wind moving through the open sky could be heard. The High Warlord did not speak immediately. Then, finally, his deep voice echoed through the air. "You admit defeat." Valithra hesitated for just a second, then nodded. "Yes." A murmur ran through the audience. A Zyrelian warrior, especially a princess, never admitted weakness. But this was not weakness. It was truth. And her father knew it. The High Warlord studied her for a long moment before shifting his gaze to Dorian. "And you, human," he said, his tone filled with curiosity. "What do you have to say?" Dorian sheathed his sword, standing firm. "She fought with honor," he replied. "She is a warrior in every way." Valithra glanced at him, surprised by his words. Did he truly respect her? Or was this another tactic of humans, to confuse their enemies with kindness? A new challenge. The High Warlord nodded slowly, then leaned forward. "Then tell me, human," he said, "if you had not stopped, would you have ended her life?" The question hung in the air like a blade ready to drop. Dorian met the High Warlord's gaze without hesitation. "Yes." The crowd gasped, and Valithra stiffened. But then Dorian spoke again. "That is what warriors do. We fight to the end." His words carried no arrogance, no disrespect, just truth. The High Warlord let out a low chuckle, a bold answer. Then he turned back to Valithra. "Rise, my daughter." She stood, keeping her head high. "You have fought well," he said, "but now you must decide. Will this loss make you weaker or stronger?" Valithra's fingers tightened around her sword's hilt. She already knew her answer. She turned to face Dorian, her expression serious. "This is not over, human," she declared. "One day I will fight you again, and I will win." Dorian smirked. "I'll be waiting." The start of something greater. The duel was over, but something deeper had begun. A rivalry, a challenge, and perhaps something neither of them could fully understand yet. The High Warlord stood, signaling the end of the battle. As the crowd finally roared to life, Valithra walked past Dorian, her mind racing with thoughts. She had lost today, but the next time they met in battle, she would be ready, and she would not fall again. The duel was over, but the fire in Princess Valithra's heart had not faded. She walked through the halls of the Zorelian Grand Palace, her armor still dusted from battle, her fingers tightening around the hilt of her sword. Every step echoed in the silent corridor. Her father's words still rang in her ears. "Will this loss make you weaker or stronger?" She clenched her jaw. She had never lost before. Not in training, not in war. She had been raised to dominate her enemies, to break them before they could break her. Yet today, in front of the entire empire, a human had defeated her. Her pride burned, but beneath that fire was something even more dangerous. a question she had never asked herself before. What if strength wasn't only about power? A warrior's reflection. Valithra entered her personal chambers, shutting the heavy metal doors behind her. The room was large, filled with ancient Zarelian weapons, banners of past victories, and a single meditation platform in the center. She placed her sword on the rack and sat down, taking a deep breath. Images of the battle replayed in her mind. The way Dorian Kane had fought, the way he had anticipated her attacks. He had not been stronger than her, yet he had won. How? She pressed her hands together, trying to silence the thoughts. Strength alone is not enough. The words she had once mocked now haunted her, a sudden visitor. A knock echoed through her chamber doors. Valithra frowned. She had ordered no one to disturb her. "Enter," she called, her voice firm. The doors slid open, and to her shock, Dorian Kane stepped inside. She stood immediately, her muscles tensing. "What are you doing here, human?" she demanded. Dorian raised an eyebrow, but showed no sign of hesitation. "Your father sent me." Valithra's frown deepened. "Why?" Dorian crossed his arms, his stance relaxed. "He wants me to stay here, to train with your warriors." Her fists clenched. The High Warlord had ordered a human to train among her people. This was an insult. "This is a mistake," she said coldly. "You do not belong here." Dorian smirked. "Afraid I'll beat you again." Valithra's eyes flashed with anger, but she refused to react. She was a princess, not a child. The challenge. Instead, she stepped forward, standing inches from him, her violet eyes locked onto his green ones. "You got lucky," she said, her voice steady. "Next time, you won't." Dorian didn't look away. "Next time, you might surprise me." His words caught her off guard. No mockery, no arrogance, only respect. Valithra studied him carefully. Humans were not like Zarelians. They did not fight for honor or tradition. They fought for survival. Maybe that was why they were so dangerous. And maybe that was why she needed to understand them. She took a deep breath. "If you are to train here," she said at last, "then I will train with you." Dorian raised an eyebrow. "You sure? You might end up liking humans." Valithra smirked. "Don't test my patience, human." A new beginning. The tension between them was still there. The rivalry. The pride. But something else had begun to take shape. A warrior's bond. And as Valithra stepped back and gestured for Dorian to follow, she knew one thing for certain. This battle was far from over. For the next few weeks, Princess Valithra and Captain Dorian Kane trained together. It was an arrangement that had never been seen in the Zarelian Empire. A human warrior teaching and learning alongside the princess of the greatest warrior race in the galaxy. At first, their training was filled with tension. Valithra was used to fighting in a strict, calculated way, her movements as precise as the finest Zarelian blade. But Dorian, he fought differently. He fought with flexibility. He didn't rely on power or speed alone. He used his mind as his greatest weapon. At first, Valithra was frustrated. She believed she was superior. She was the princess, the heir to the empire. And yet, time and again, Dorian proved that strength alone was not enough. He would dodge her strikes, slipping past her defenses with ease, and show her new ways to use her agility, her awareness of the battlefield, and her quick thinking to defeat an opponent. It was humbling. A test of will. One afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Valithra and Dorian stood in the training yard. Both were covered in sweat, their bodies sore from hours of practice. The sound of their swords clashing rang out in the quiet yard. Valithra was exhausted, but she refused to stop. She was determined to prove herself. She attacked again, her blade cutting through the air. But Dorian blocked it with ease, his movements smooth and controlled. "You're fighting too hard," Dorian said calmly, sidestepping her attack. "You need to relax." Valithra gritted her teeth, her grip tightening on her sword. She wasn't about to let a human lecture her on how to fight. "Relax," she hissed, launching another strike. "I'm not here to relax. I'm here to win." Dorian dodged her strike once more. "Winning isn't everything." "What do you mean?" Valithra snapped. "You defeat your enemies to win." Dorian paused for a moment, then locked eyes with her. "It's not just about defeating them. It's about knowing why you fight, knowing when to strike, and knowing when to let go of your pride." Valithra's chest tightened. She had always been taught that pride was strength. Without it, a warrior was nothing. But something about Dorian's words stuck with her. Let go of her pride. Was that what she had been doing wrong all this time? Her sword trembled in her hands as she stepped back, her thoughts swirling. She could feel the doubt creeping in again. She had been pushing herself to the limit, using all her strength and willpower to win each battle. But Dorian, he wasn't like that. He fought with purpose, not for pride, but for understanding. For the moment of truth. Dorian stepped forward, his eyes studying her carefully. "You're stronger than this," he said quietly. "You're not fighting your opponent. You're fighting yourself." Valithra's heart skipped a beat. For the first time, she realized that Dorian was not just teaching her how to fight. He was teaching her how to become something more. She took a deep breath, the weight of his words settling inside her. Her sword lowered slightly as she looked at him, her gaze softening. "I don't know if I can let go of everything I've been taught," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "I've always been the best. I've always had to be the best." Dorian smiled gently. "You're already better than you think. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, not even yourself." Valithra looked down at her sword, considering his words. For a moment, she wasn't sure if she was ready to give up the identity that had been so deeply woven into her life. She was Valithra, the heir to the Xyrelian throne. She was a warrior. She was meant to win. But as she stood in the quiet of the training yard, the breeze tugging at her hair, she realized something. It wasn't about winning every fight. It was about understanding the bigger picture, about knowing when to push, when to pull back, and when to adapt. A new beginning. With a deep exhale, Valithra finally nodded. She lifted her sword, this time with a new understanding. She didn't attack immediately. Instead, she watched Dorian, studying his movements. She waited, not out of hesitation, but because she now understood the value of patience. Dorian didn't attack either. For the first time, they stood facing each other, two warriors, understanding each other not through pride, but through mutual respect. And when Valithra finally moved, it was different. She didn't just rely on speed or strength. She relied on her mind and her instincts, as Dorian had taught her. The sword in her hand moved with precision. Dorian met her strike with a fluid motion, but this time, Valithra wasn't just matching his movements. She was learning, evolving in the middle of the fight. And for the first time, she felt like she was not just fighting to win. She was fighting to become better. The days that followed were filled with hours of training, learning, and growing. Princess Valithra and Captain Dorian Kane worked side by side, each teaching the other lessons they had never learned before. The training yard had become a place of quiet focus, where the clash of swords was no longer the loud, overwhelming noise it had been at the beginning. Now, it was the rhythm of warriors. Each strike, each movement, was deliberate, a conversation between two people who were becoming something more than adversaries. Valithra had learned to think as much as she fought. She began to understand the importance of patience and strategy, no longer rushing into every battle with pure force. She had adapted, just as Dorian had taught her. But there were still moments when her old instincts, her old pride, tried to take over. When she felt herself getting frustrated, ready to fight with all her might, Dorian would remind her of the lesson she had learned. Strength is not about overwhelming your opponent. It's about knowing when to hold back and when to act. One day, after hours of sparring in the warm light of the setting sun, Valithra dropped her sword with a tired sigh. The weight of the training had finally caught up with her, but in a different way. She wasn't exhausted from the fight itself. She was exhausted from thinking. Dorian stopped and wiped the sweat from his brow. "You're improving," he said with a nod of approval. "But you're still fighting yourself." Valithra ran a hand through her hair, her mind still spinning from the endless moves, the constant thinking, the new way of fighting she was trying to master. "I know," she said, her voice quiet. "I'm not sure how to stop." Dorian set his sword aside and walked over to her. "It's not about stopping. It's about finding balance. You don't have to throw away everything you've learned. You just have to learn how to merge it with what you've learned here. You need both your strength and your mind." Valithra looked at him. "But what if I make a mistake? What if I fail again?" Dorian smiled. "Failure isn't the end, Valithra. It's just part of learning. What matters is what you do with it. You don't give up. You keep moving forward." For a moment, Valithra stood in silence. She thought about all the times she had been taught that a warrior's path was about never showing weakness, about being unbeatable. She had always believed that strength was about winning, and that if you lost, you had failed. But now, after all the training, after facing Dorian in battle and learning from him, she understood that true strength wasn't just about winning. It was about growing, about understanding yourself and your opponent. Maybe I've been wrong about strength this whole time," Valithra admitted softly. Dorian chuckled, stepping back to pick up his sword. "I think we all are, sometimes. But that's part of the journey, right?" Valithra smiled, the weight of the battle in her chest finally beginning to ease. She didn't feel like she had to be perfect anymore. She didn't have to be the strongest. She just had to be the best version of herself, one that could adapt and learn from every challenge. As the days turned into weeks, Valithra found herself changing in ways she had never expected. Her training with Dorian was no longer just about physical strength. It was about growth, about understanding her emotions, her weaknesses, and using them to her advantage. She wasn't fighting against herself anymore. She was learning to fight with herself. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, the two of them sat together on the edge of the training yard, watching the sky turn from orange to deep purple. Valithra leaned back, feeling a rare moment of peace. "I never imagined learning from a human," she said thoughtfully. Dorian glanced at her with a small smile. "I never imagined being taught by a princess." She chuckled. "I guess we both have a lot to learn." "Indeed," Dorian agreed, his gaze steady. "But that's the beauty of it. We never stop learning. Not as warriors, not as people." Valithra looked at him, a soft smile on her lips. "Thank you, Dorian, for showing me that." Dorian nodded. "No need to thank me. You did the work. You chose to grow. And that's the hardest part." They sat in silence for a while, their thoughts resting on the lessons they had learned, on the journey they had taken together. The bond between them was no longer just about rivalry or pride. It was about mutual respect, a shared understanding of the struggles of being a warrior and a human. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Valithra realized that strength wasn't about defeating your opponent in every battle. It was about learning how to face the world, how to fight with wisdom, patience, and heart. And maybe, just maybe, she had finally begun to understand what it truly meant to be strong.